This is the third in a small series, hopefully a longer series to come, of discussions about the New Zealand project by Max Harris. And in this, I'm going to discuss the chapter 6 is called Social Infrastructure, Health, Education and Housing. Listen to this for an opening. Healthcare, education and housing are social infrastructure. Just as roads and bridges and ports form the infrastructure that underpins our economy, so too healthcare, education and housing form the infrastructure that underpins our society. What a wonderful opening. Welcome, Max Harris. I had never thought about it like that. As important as our roads, and we know that's the way we get our goods to port, we get things exported, we make money. So healthcare, education and housing underpin the very basics of society, don't they?
That's right. They're like the building blocks of the kind of social fabric we have.
So take us to what we've had. We've had an undermining of the basic building blocks.
That's right. I think, especially in the last 30 years, there's been this move away from public providing of healthcare and housing and education. It's become at least a bit frayed around the edges. So we once had this commitment to everyone having a house, especially if they were really in need through state housing. We once had this commitment to no-cost public education. Now kind of costs are creeping through in different ways. And we had a commitment to universal healthcare, which has been kind of chipped away at. And these areas are all connected. People with poor housing are more likely to get respiratory illnesses or cardiovascular disease. People having difficulties in education will then have kind of flow-on harms for themselves, and there are often links through to mental health. So what I say is I think we need to see these three parts of our social infrastructure together and commit to them again if we're going to have a values-based politics.
Children cannot learn if they don't have a warm, safe home to learn in.
Exactly.
I've been talking to the homeless on the streets, and many of them say, we want to get jobs, but we have to have a home first. Somewhere to wash their clothes. Something as basic as that. How did this come about, Max? Give us some background.
So there are different stories to be told of each of those areas, but what I would say is in the 1980s there was also a push towards kind of expert, specialised thinking, which slightly disconnected some of our thinking in each of these areas. And there's been a push towards the role of the market and the role of private providers of housing, of education and of healthcare. That's ended up leading to less of a commitment to government provision. So recently we had sale of state housing without very much public outcry. Unfortunately, there were some people that really did try to stand up. So what I think is there are some policy steps that have kind of chipped away at the social infrastructure, but actually there's been a loss of an underlying cultural commitment to these parts of our social infrastructure.
And I would go further and say there was some cynicism. I was talking to some inhabitants of Glen Innes who've been there since it was countryside at the back of, in Auckland, at the back of St Heliers there. Very valuable land now. These houses were being spirited away at 10 o'clock at night, midnight. This was perhaps a concerted effort to keep that out of the media news. So how do these new ways of doing social housing benefit those sorts of people who need social housing, or are we talking profit motive, Max? Is there a clash of motivations here?
So I think in the area of state housing, we've lost the commitment to giving people a house as of right where they're in need, and I think that has come from an underlying cultural shift, which has been created by this push towards the market, this push towards the idea that we all need to kind of save up and buy our homes. And at the same time, of course, we know that house prices have skyrocketed and have made it harder and harder for lots of people to buy homes without family support or other sources of income.
And some of the locals said to me that the land is so valuable, they can see a lot of profit being taken by others. So there's a big profit-taking motive to get rid of this social housing on valuable land.
So there's also been this values shift in seeing a house not as a home but as a way of making money, as an investment device. And that has led to kind of quick selling on of houses, and the result of that is government trying to open up land in order to try to find ways to give people homes again. But in doing that and trying to find that new land, the government has also kicked a lot of people out of state houses or important shelters. And so what I think is we need to kind of get at the root of the problem with a bit more clear thinking. Part of the root is, I think, this individualistic, market-oriented way of thinking, which has had very different effects in different areas. So in education, what it's meant is this kind of pushing of power down to the local level, and I think some of that has been quite positive in that there's been some community ownership, but what it's also done is left schools being very competitive with each other, and that's something that kind of is a little like how people operate within a market, but except what we're talking about here are schools, we're talking about communities, and I think that's stopped the kind of cooperation we need between schools and communities. So we can tell different stories, but I think we're seeing a sort of worrying slide away from the pillars of social infrastructure that have really been important in our country in the past.
You also make an interesting suggestion that perhaps teachers in low decile schools should be paid more. Why do you suggest something like that?
So I suggest that tentatively because I think there probably is going to be a bit of pushback on that from people that think all teachers do great jobs and should be paid the same amount. But I think we do see this growing educational inequality. And that's partly come about through tomorrow's schools, which has also had some role to play in segregation of where people live by ethnicity. So it's contributed to us growing apart. And I think it's made teaching in a Decile 1 school just qualitatively different from teaching in Decile 10 school. And there are different ways to respond to that, and paying teachers more is just one way to respond to that. But I think we at least need a debate about this inequality, and we need to take other steps to try to reduce that inequality so that everyone knows they have quality public schooling. Since public schooling is how, as Sean Elias once said, we learn to live in a community. It's how we learn to live with different people, with difficult people, with a varied group of people. And it's a kind of cornerstone of our society, and I think we've forgotten that.
And if children emerge from schools where it's really just one sector of the New Zealand population, it's harder to relate to one another. It really does downgrade the society. This is all against the background in each of these discussions, Max, of the 4 values, and I think we should just reprise those here. So the 4 values you advocate in the New Zealand Project, can you just run over those briefly?
Yeah, so there's care, community, creativity and love. So deep concern for others, care, community, a recognition we're interdependent, we rely on each other. Creativity, a sense of like imagination and play. Love, a deep sense of warmth for another that kind of underpins all of those values. And I think what's worrying about this kind of growing apart through educational inequality is it eats away at each of those values. It stops us from caring about people in a different position. It erodes the very social bonds that make up our community, and it stops us from being imaginative, from empathising, and from showing love to each other.
When I have been working with homeless people, what has struck me are a number of things. All of them have trauma in their childhoods. Yeah. Most of them have mental health issues and own up to those. One beautiful Māori man who's been on the streets for 10 years said when he's called by winds, he gets such severe anxiety that he misses his appointments. When he misses his appointments, he's punished. So that's the third strand, the punitive welfare system we have, which is based on the opposite idea of your values of love and care and community. It says, if you don't do what I want, things will become much harder for you. I will make it really tough.
Yeah.
That policy, I just don't understand. Is this coming from that neoliberal change that happened in the 80s?
I think partly, yeah. So I think in the 80s there was a real push for the state to be small, at least in some respects. So what we saw in the 80s was the project of building up some ideas around power of the individual, the power of the market, the problems with the state, and that gave government space to do things they wanted to make the state smaller. And in particular, it involved cutting benefit levels, chipping away at the power of unions through the Employment Contracts Act in 1991. And at the same time, that kind of bolted onto an underlying strain of punitiveness that probably existed in New Zealand culture for a while. And that combination of that punitiveness with that values shift in the 80s has made it easier for narratives to build up about people on welfare being cheats, people on welfare being bludgers, and that's created suspicion in the community rather than sympathy.
And it pushes people to be much less caring in their own lives, which impacts the people who are much less caring. There's a deep loneliness in people when we don't care for one another, isn't there?
Yeah.
There's an isolationism.
Yeah, as you say, it's sort of like a vicious circle where the less we care, the less experience we have, the easier it is to kind of shut ourselves off and believe we're just individual units as opposed to being kind of webbed in different relationships and networks in society. And yeah, loneliness is another topic that I think we don't talk about enough in New Zealand, and I think it's a sign of a disconnected society. I've done some work with people sleeping rough as well, and one thing that comes up there has been the fact that it's very lonely. I remember someone coming to me and saying, I went into the pub just because I wanted to talk to someone. So yeah, a lack of care breeds like disinterest, and that itself makes loneliness worse for people.
There are many things the people on the streets want, but one of them is, please talk to me as, one of them said to me the other day, I'm a human just like you. So it's recognizing again that they're but for the grace of God go all of us, and also they are us. We are all this oneness.
Exactly,
That idea of values coming in to cure or to benefit the least, the ones who are suffering in our society. Is it really doable, Max, or is this just a beautiful utopian world that is unreachable? What do you feel?
No, I think it is really doable, but I think what it takes is first seeing that actually we had a big values shift in the 1980s. So for people that think this isn't possible, we should know we moved in the opposite direction 20 or 30 years ago, and if we could move in that opposite direction, then I think we can do the reverse. And I think
I've often wondered, though, there is an innately selfish side to human beings, and there's a magnificent side to humans. But when the selfish side takes hold, it's very hard to get its tentacles off, isn't it?
It is, and I think it's Walt Whitman who says, we all contain multitudes, so we all probably have, kind of punitive bone in our body, we all have a kind bone in our body. To me, often I think politics is about drawing out particular parts of the population, and it should be, to me, about drawing out the best in us. What was interesting to me was going to Norway to look at their criminal justice system, and there were a few things that people said there to me that were relevant to this discussion. I mean, one was that a prison governor at Bastøy prison said to me that justice means more than revenge, and revenge in criminal justice is a bit like pissing your pants in Norway. It first feels good, and then you start to freeze. And I think the reason that is relevant to what we're saying is that idea about revenge, it flows not just through our prison system, but also elsewhere through our beneficiary system. But the other thing that was interesting in Norway is that a lot of people think that Norway has kind of always had a different approach on prisons and related issues. But actually, people told me there was a big shift in the 1970s. Norway had been punitive too. And there are still people in Norway saying we need to send people to prison for longer. But there was a shift away from punitiveness towards forgiveness. That's what people told me. And
healing within that.
And within that, healing. And it was done, I was told, through a campaigning group that worked very hard called CROM. And every year they brought together prisoners and politicians and others. And it was done through a politician who was really brave called Inger Louise Valle, who over 6 years stood up to opposition, pushed back criticism, and made sure these changes lasted, and they were sustained through later years. So I think we can also look to other countries and see where these kind of seemingly radical changes were possible.
And that's interesting because a similar population size, a similar, slightly isolated, they have an individualistic way of doing things. We have that in New Zealand, don't we? We've been highly individual in some things. Look at the anti-nuclear stance. So we have that in our makeup. How do we become more world leaders on this one?
Well, I think first we have to decide what we want to be world leaders on, I mean, there's nothing good in itself about being world leading, say, on youth suicide, right, or on these other measures. And actually, even on positive measures like certain gender measures, being world leading might mean nothing other than the fact that the rest of the world has a long way to go as well. So I think what we do want to push for is innovating and a culture of experimentation that means we're searching for the better way that is guided by our own lights, by our own values. And how do we do that? Well, yeah, I think part of it is being willing to try new things here, and that there is a kind of strain of that in the Kiwi spirit and the kind of number 8 wire mentality. And we need to be a bit more open about allowing government to have space to experiment in order to do that. But also we need politicians who are a bit bolder and a bit braver. I sat on a panel with Prime Minister Bill English last year, and he said he wanted to do some of the things I was talking about in the field of justice, but he said the main barrier was you, and he pointed to the audience. And I thought, actually, the public that I've talked to, the public that I see, the public that I think I know, though I wouldn't claim to know more than I do, is more willing to have a mature conversation about change in the criminal justice space. And we also know that there's evidence from the states that politicians in the states overestimate how conservative the public is. They think the public's more conservative than the public really is. And I think that'd be true in New Zealand as well. So that boldness, that bravery will mean we can innovate and try the things we need to do.
And that may well get back to your earlier suggestion that people lead the politicians, not the other way around.
Exactly, yeah.
So let's look at the justice, because there's an excellent chapter in the book about the whole justice system, and you mention Norway and a very low recidivism rate there. Economically, that makes sense, doesn't it? Because having people in prison costs a lot of money for this country, and it's wasted money.
Yeah, and it costs more, 90 to 100,000 a year to send someone to prison than it does to send someone to university. But we actually have known that argument for a while, and I don't think that's completely cut through. And part of why I think that is it is a bit of a technocratic argument. And I actually think we need to get back to saying prisons are a failure of care. They deny people social contact, they tear families apart. They also exclude some people from community, that second value, and they're a failure of imagination. They're a lazy, easy response to something going wrong.
That puts it really well, and that doesn't even take account of when they come out of prison and they can't get housing. They're excluded from housing because of a prison because of a prison record. So then we have another failure. Many of them on the streets have been in prison. Yeah,
exactly. So when we use those kind of values as our navigating lights, prisons don't stack up that well. And I think we need to get back to that values-based argument on top of the economic argument in order to kind of...
Let's look at what a prison based on these 4 values might look like. Sure. How would that work, Max, in your fertile imagination? How do you see it?
So the first thing I'd say is maybe we need to think even bigger and think that actually we need to move away from prisons altogether. And what I do push for in the book is decarceration, in the words of Angela Davis, which is phasing out prisons. But to the extent we need something like a protective institution for the very worst of offenders, I think we could look to Norway. And I went to a prison in Norway called Bastøy, and that was very different from the prisons I've been to in the UK and New Zealand. And I've taught in a prison in the UK and spent time in prisons in New Zealand. One thing that was different was there was a real focus on meaningful work that gave fulfillment to the people in there, the inmates. So they were doing farming work, fishing, academic work.
And I love that, because there was also this sense of community, that everybody depended on everybody else.
Yeah, and so they talked about being neighbours there, and the inmates lived in flats together, and they were also kind of in flats where they could learn from each other. So there was one prisoner with not such good hygiene who was placed with a flatmate who was able to teach the other prisoner kind of some certain kind of soft life skills. They also talked about another principle of normality, of trying to build a prison that was normal, that was like the outside world. And you saw that when you got there. It's on this island, but there's a lot of space. There's the buildings were relatively normal, whereas if you see a prison in New Zealand, it doesn't look normal at all, and most people don't want to see prisons. They're out of sight, out of mind. So I think some of those principles are what we could base our prison system on. The prison governor who I mentioned earlier, Tom Eberhardt, also said to me, we haven't taken these inmates' hope away because they don't hate society. And I think that's kind of different to my experience in New Zealand prisons, where sometimes prisons are seen as sort of part of the punishment, and a difficult experience in prison is seen as part of an appropriate response, rather than prisons or protective institutions being places where some hope is sustained for a life beyond those walls.
Max, that sounds really benign,
Yeah.
and human beings all have a capacity to heal.
Yeah.
But let's face it, there'll be people out there saying, you're dealing with the worst criminals, sometimes gangs, violence, innate violence that they will never stop.
Yeah.
What do you say to that?
Well, the first thing I'd say to that is on this prison, Bastoy prison on the island, there were people who had committed very serious offences, and the prison didn't say, oh, well, we're going to implement the principle of normality just for the low-level offenders. They were committed to this for everyone, because they
For
thought...
murderers?
For murderers, yeah, for people that had done the very worst things. And, you know, I'm not diminishing the harm that was caused there, but I'm saying we need to try to address why people end up doing those things. Otherwise, we leave people released from prison still being of risk to society. So we know from Norway that actually there's also low levels of recidivism and low levels of offending from this approach. So this is an approach that also makes us safer, because it gets at why these offenders are actually victims as well in their own lives. And they've often been victims of abuse. They've often been victims of all kinds of wrongdoing too. I think this is actually not a soft approach. It's quite a soft approach when you leave someone staring at a wall without addressing the roots of their offending in a prison. This is an approach, as with restorative justice methods, that forces people to confront the causes of their offending. That's actually really hard, but that's also what we need.
I love what you say too, that ultimately it makes the whole community safer when they do come up, which they will. They can start to be constructive, not destructive members of society.
Exactly.
But we don't think like this, do we? We think short term, you must be punished, you must be outcast. We must see you suffer. The idea of this again comes back to good values of community care, and aroha, if you like, the love. If somebody heals, there is a chance for a really different kind of life when they come out of prison. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. And we're wasting a whole lot of human, people in these prisons by leaving them there and not giving them any hope for a different life. The other thing that people say very reasonably is, well, what about the victims, who faced like a serious wrong that has affected their life? Isn't it necessary that people go into prison in order to provide closure for the victims? Actually, what we know is those kinds of long prison sentences can re-traumatize the victim. They cannot be the best thing for victims. But more importantly...
What do you mean by that? It keeps it in their psyche?
Yes, in different ways. And then also when the prisoner comes out, this is we know from the work of Rethinking Crime and Punishment that the organisation Kim Workman was involved with, when they come out, that all of the trauma associated with offending can come up again for the victim. So that the long prison sentence doesn't do very much for the victim. But more importantly, I think we can care for victims, because I think victims are a vulnerable group that probably need even more support than they're getting at the moment from the government, while also caring for people that have offended. And I think we can't just care for kind of small groups in the population, or just for our in-group, or just for groups we like. The whole point of a values-based politics is we try to apply these values as expansively as possible, and we say care, community and creativity are things that all of the people in our society deserve.
I've often thought that with victims, the idea from the marae, which is being heard, would be extremely powerful if it was at the right point, where a prisoner could sit and hear the effect on a family of losing somebody they loved to a perpetrator.
And we have that in part in our system with victim impact statements. There are different views on those. But what we know from our youth justice system is that family group conferencing works very well. And this is where victims and families and offenders and families come together, and the offender hears about the real human impact of offending. And when we know, again, that holds the offender to account in a really tough way, and it's not easy, but it also helps healing on both sides. And it's that kind of approach that I think we need a little bit more of in our adult system.
So as you say, it's a failed experiment. It's a lack of imagination. And I think that we can look abroad. Are there other countries that particularly inspire you around the world, Max, when you look at a values-based system for New Zealand? Are there other countries whose example we can follow?
I actually don't think there's one country that has sort of done it all right. If there were, I think this project would be a lot easier for us. But I think we can pick and choose certain features of countries' policies. I do think Scandinavian countries provide some interesting models on environmental issues. I think Denmark has some really good policies. I think in the area of work, Finland has really pioneered some new ways, but actually those societies have their own problems and they have their own ongoing debates. What they do show is that you can shift using values towards a better way, and I think we need to find the values that are most appropriate to us. I'm drawing on that example.
It would be wonderful to have a government-sponsored trip of people like you who really want to understand what's happening in those countries. Finland's a great example of education. They were languishing at the bottom of the tables, and they've, through a totally new system, gone to the top, really, haven't they?
Yeah, and we can shift things that quickly here in New Zealand. I mean, there are other examples I could give as well. Canada has an interesting sentencing law which tries to address overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in prison, which is a huge problem in New Zealand, where Māori have made up more than 50% of the prison population since the 1980s. In Holland and in Belgium, there have been steps to try to reduce the prison population. So it would be great if our politicians looked to these other places. And in particular, I think we need to start looking to new places for the best ideas. So we kind of have this conveyor belt of traditional neighbours, and we pull off the best ideas we see in the UK, Canada, Australia. But actually we need a kind of bigger and better conveyor belt and look at countries beyond those old neighbours. And I think it'll be particularly important to do that as our demographics change. We know that Pākehā will be a minority in New Zealand. European New Zealanders will be a minority, and that Asian New Zealanders are growing in number. Māori are growing in number.
Indian New Zealanders.
Indian and New Zealanders too. Yeah, exactly. So I think as those demographics change, we're going to need to look to new countries that better parallel who we are. And I think there are some great ideas as well from South America. I think from Southern Africa. We need really open-minded politicians who are willing to search for what's best.
I want to end, though, with the classic closed-minded response, which is, how do you pay for all this? It's all going to cost too much.
Yeah.
Do we need a redistribution tax-wise? Do we need the very rich New Zealander who has a $70 million yacht, perhaps to buy a $50 million yacht and put a bit more into the centralised pool to help some of these ideas?
Yeah, I think so. I think we need to be talking more confidently about how important it is for resources to be redistributed in New Zealand, and not to flinch or make concessions or qualifiers about it. I think we can have a society where the wealthy pays a little bit more.
There's been a tremendous subservience around that idea, hasn't there, for 30 years? A fear of bringing that up.
Exactly.
And a great derision from often media commentators about that.
And that's built up over time, but I think it's starting to shift, actually. I hear in the community more people uncomfortable with the social problems they see from an under-resourced state. And more people thinking that this is an ugly society that is growing apart and that needs to change. Also, when you look at other countries like the UK under a Conservative government, they pay a lot more income tax. The top rate of tax in the UK is 45%, and our top rate is 33%. It doesn't mean we have to pay a top rate of 90%, but I think, if you earn more than $70,000, you pay the same rate of tax when you earn $75,000 top rate as if you're earning $5 million. And I think that doesn't really chime with our ideas of fairness. So what I say in the book is, maybe people earning, say, between $70,000 and $150,000 could pay a little bit more than 33%. And maybe people that are earning a lot, in the hundreds of thousands and the millions, could pay a little more still. And we could talk about other tools of tax as well, like wealth taxes, which cover people that do inherit a lot of wealth and are able to build up wealth that way. This is not about envy or jealousy or cutting people down. It's just about saying part of being in a society is agreeing to chip in and contribute to institutions we all benefit from. And I think we need to reopen that conversation.
I always love the idea of a classroom. If you go into a classroom and two children have most of the papers and pens, and the rest of the classroom's sharing one pen and one piece of paper, the teacher's going to say, we redistribute this. This isn't going to work in the classroom.
Exactly. Or
the society's the same.
Or remedial reading, which is a part of primary school, where we say we actually don't treat everyone in the same way. We say, for some people there might need to be a bit more resources directed in order to ensure we can all get up to a level where we can succeed. So yeah, I think it's actually in our bones, and it is a commitment in all of us that we just need to be willing to talk about again.
A great way to end a discussion on social infrastructure, and the book is The New Zealand Project. It's written by Max Harris. Thank you, Max.
Thanks so much.